apologies. I lost my connection and just got it back. Thank you again, Will.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, so let's see who's here. We've got myself, Thomas is here, Chase Dews is here, Lonnie, Dave Clark, Gary, whose mic is off right now, TJ, Darren Mellering, back to Will. So, okay, we've got a good group today. And again, I want to thank Will twice now for suggesting we just go to automatic recording so my brain cells don't have to worry about connecting. And also for sending me the link, which got me right back onto the
Perfect
Zoom meeting. So anyway, I want to do two things today. First, I want to briefly go over the last meeting we had, kind of summarizing things because the wondrous one here forgot to push the record button. And once I make my comment, if any of you would like to add anything, feel free to do so. But keep in mind, keep this as a summary. James Blount, we'd like to keep this as a summary of who else is coming on? A summary more than a full discussion of it. Okay, so the first one was comparing Budoshin with Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do. Take what's useful and discard what is not. I feel that's mostly true. And for the general practitioner, not so much for the teacher. Suffice it to say, it's hard to decide what's useful and what's not. As a student, you can pick and choose. As an instructor, if you're going to be a good instructor, you have to be able to teach everything you've learned, assuming you can physically do it. And there are a lot of techniques that Seki taught that are in the Densho that I cannot do particularly well, but I still see it as my responsibility to teach it. And some students really pick up on the technique and it becomes their favorite. And there's an old argument that says if students only remember what they like when they become sensei, they have less to teach. And that works its way down after several generations until you as a sensei are teaching only one technique, because that's all you know, or that's all you felt was worth keeping. So anyway, I think the issue, what do you discard, still exists, and it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard for a student to make that decision until they get fairly well involved with the art. I'd probably say someplace around in the brown belt range. They've at that point they've pretty much made a commitment, and their outlook should change. So that's all I wanted to say about that one. If anyone wants to add anything in, you're more than welcome to.
If I might say something just briefly, Professor, for about 20 years, I've had the opportunity to do ancillary training in Jeet Kune Do and Kali. And as someone who started out in Kung Fu myself, so much of what Bruce Lee is doing actually does boil down to some combination of Filipino arts and Wing Chun. I think from our perspective, as I think about Budoshin, the one big difference is there is a Densho. There is a more or less static body of knowledge, a canon. And that makes a huge difference generationally, as you just pointed out. And that's been the one thing that I've been frustrated with in my learning of Jeet Kune Do and Kali is I never have the sense of, okay, I've moved forward in the curriculum. I'm not saying that there isn't curricula, involved, but and there's no real reference point. It comes back to, well, we can do this or we can do that. And so it's created in me a little bit of a disconnect at times, and I don't want to sound too critical, but that's probably why I'm drawn more to something that has a canon of knowledge about it. So for what that's worth.
Any other thoughts?
I'm going to throw something out that's a little bit a curveball. I do a lot of water polo, full contact water polo. You're in the water. You don't have feet on your ground. But I adapt all the jujitsu techniques to being no feet on the ground. We're in the water. And so, you know, the canon of techniques and whatnot, you have to be able to adapt them to unusual situations. So in the water, there's no gravity. Anyway, just my toss out thought.
Jace, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess if I had to weigh in on this, I had to bring up the fact that the guy who runs the gym that Conor McGregor trains at, Straight Blast Gym, he was actually one of Dan Inosanto's first generation students, and he was like really big into Jeet Kune Do at one point. What he got frustrated with, though, is that there was a split between the Jeet Kune Do concepts community and like the traditionalists who were more concerned with actually preserving the techniques that Bruce Lee favored versus the concept group, which, as Ms. TJ was saying, that like spreads out and just applies their concepts to like a bunch of seemingly random techniques. So I mean, it just sounds like that's the same kind of situation, and I think it's just very situationally. You know, I'm actually starting to take a more reductionist look at all of the techniques that I'm aware of at the moment, and trying to boil down concepts so that I can apply those concepts to a bunch of different techniques and still say, like, my steps are X, Y, and Z for that. But that's just me, and that's just more credence to it being situational per student, you know?
One of the things I occasionally bring up to my students is that, where am I here in the great scheme of things? One of the things I bring up to my students is that in jujitsu, probably in every martial art, there may be 30 or 40 core techniques, basic techniques. And once you get those down, and I've been teaching for 54 years, I probably couldn't write down those 30 or 40 core techniques. But what's nice about once you have those down, or those concepts down, or those, whatever you want to call it, you find that they can be applied to almost any situation. And as my sensei said, at some point, the attack is irrelevant. You do what you're going to do. And one of the nice things that I've liked about Budoshin Jujitsu is that you're not, there are very few situations where there's only one technique for this attack. And so depending on your skill level, that determines what you do, but still you're working from this core of techniques. And if you understand them and know them, you can put them together in almost any combination you want. And I know there was Jerry Hines or Scott Anderson, one of the two who does wonders with statistics, came up with maybe there are, if you do the statistics on all of this, you're looking at maybe 20 or 30,000 techniques, 40,000. I mean, you know, and at some point it becomes irrelevant because you can't be good at everything. So anyone else want to add anything to this one topic?
If I might just say one other thing, it's an interesting, to me, if you take the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, the book, and you take Professor Kirby, you're toward one technique, those two books, albeit coming from different perspectives, are really where I think there is a parity between what Budoshin is after and what he was after, because it really does come down to the key kernel of what needs to happen. And I think that what you did when you presented that book was, it's kind of like the Tao of Budoshin in my mind as I've looked at it. So I think that there is some connection there.
Okay.
Real quickly, in Hatha Yoga, they say there are 100,000 different postures, but of these, they're all variations on 1,000. And those thousands, they're really only variations on these 100. And out of those 100, there's only 5 that you actually need to know. Then you'll figure out all your own variations.
Are we obliterating this depth of knowledge? It's an interesting philosophical question anyway.
We are inherently creative.
They're inherently creative.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on. The Budoshin Jujitsu cross certification process. The reason we did that, because there are 2 reasons. One, from a self-interest point of view, it creates more Budoshin Jujitsu dojo that are what am I looking for here? That can teach Budoshin Jujitsu. Okay, so one reason is to create more Budoshin Jujitsu dojo. That's from my own perspective. I'd like to see the art expand. I'd like to see it grow. Someday I'm going to go to the great tatami up in the sky. I hope that's where I end up. And there'll be other people continuing the art after me. Okay. The other reason is that most traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu are basically alike once you get past the terminology and variations in teaching and all the other stuff. And I've just found from experience that if you put a bunch of Jiu-Jitsu together, about the same belt rank range, and let them work out, it's amazing how much common knowledge they share with each other. And I've seen that happen on the mat, and it's just a pleasure to watch, because you've got these, distinct, Hakuru, Danzanru, Budoshin, Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, yada, yada, yada. But you put them all together on the mat, and lo and behold, they can work with each other once they get past the terminology issues in Japanese and English. I think the best technique that I've heard of was, for those of you that are familiar with Tomonagi, which I simply learned was a stomach throw. I think there's one rule that refers to it, the cow jumps over the moon. And that's a concept I can't quite grasp. But anyway, different systems give their techniques different names. Some are good, some are very creative. Anyway, so the purpose of doing the cross certification is to get black belts from other Ru that are interested in teaching and giving rank in Budoshin Jujitsu the ability to do that. We get about 6 to 10 applicants a year, and we've been doing this since 2015. I believe there are about 4 or 5 that have actually gone through the process and made it. And what frustrates most of them is the fact that they've got to put their terminology next to our terminology and pick up on our terminology, because again, in my book and in Mark's book, Mark Tucker, who administers the program, if they're going to teach Budoshin Jujitsu, they need to use Budoshin Jujitsu terminology out of fairness. And so most people get hung up on the, not that they can't do it, but they don't think they can do it. And I'm sure all of you as sensei or as students recognize that our biggest hurdle to learning anything is that we don't think we can. So that's the reason for the cross certification program. I just had one person that said they sent me an email last week. They said, I'm with such and such organization. I'd be proud to present you with a certificate of promotion in Aru if you will just send me a certificate of promotion into Budoshin. And I said, thank you very much, but my world doesn't work that way. So anyway, because it's a piece of paper, but if you've got it up on the wall, people assume or expect you to be able to do that. And some sensei collect wallpaper, which is what I refer to it as. So anyway, I think I got off track there. Any thoughts or comments on this, or?
Real quick, old man carries a fish. This is a technique. It's, one of a chinna, right? And they call these things like old man carrying a fish. Cow jumps over the moon. It gets a little crazy with our animal models.
I agree. Yeah. And,
Professor, I'm the one that I think sent you that question. I've been working through that process myself with Mr. Tucker, and it was quite a bit of writing and work to go through and pair up on the app side. What I have found, I've paused it at this point for this reason, and I do intend to resume it, is the demonstration pieces. The system, and I think whoever is conveying the system looks different sometimes based on where you're at in learning. And I found that in my engagement, for example, with Mr. Tucker, he was asking me to do a lot more Krav Maga type responses. And I trained in Krav Maga. I do some of that, but I had to step back and say, okay, wait a minute. I want to make sure that I'm actually going to do the jujitsu stuff, because Krav Maga looks very different. And so it's been good as I've wrestled through it and thought through it. But one thing that it did help for those of you who may consider it, and if your system that you're in now doesn't have a densho, it forced our system that I teach, Sensory Jiu-Jitsu, to actually put down on paper an actual densho, because I had to be able to cross-reference. And so there's been a real plus side out of that, because now all of our instructors are not having to call me. They're actually saying, oh, it's right here. So I do, Lord willing, plan to finish it and go through it, but it's been an interesting process.
Okay, and you're essentially bringing up one of the, Mark does have a background in Krav Maga, and that does influence how he teaches Budoshin Jujitsu. One of so if I really didn't have to write anything down until I wanted to get the program approved for teaching in the classroom. And then the principal said to me, well, if you want to do this, you've got to write the belt rank requirements down, yada, yada, yada. And so at that point, I had to step away from Seki's approach, which was, gee, you've been here for 4 months, you can do X, Y, and Z, therefore you get a promotion. And there's no, it's a traditional way of doing things, but there, if you have to have objectives and all this other stuff, some of which has value, you have to step away from, well, they learned something, to, this is what they learned. And that's where the belt rank exams came from, and eventually the denture, once I put it together. All right, and I forgot the other thought I had on. Well, we'll let that pass. Okay.
Professor, may I ask a follow-on question
Sure.
related?
Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Just so you know, for the future, some of this video I've tested 2 people now via Zoom for black belt, and prior to that, there's it's a 2 or 3 page set of directions on how to do a video securely, and the person has to follow those rules to the letter. Otherwise, the test is void. No excuses, no exceptions. And the nice thing about Zoom is because it's pretty close to live, and you can actually, plus you're able to record it. So there's more of an exchange and interchange between the student who's testing and the sensei that's doing running the test. And I found it to be so much better. And it's virtually eliminated all the security issues, which was a real pain in the derriere, for lack of a better phrase. But on brown and black belt exams, you do have to have a certain level of security to assure the credibility of the test. And so as long as I can do the Zoom conferencing, I will do that for testing for brown and black belt. It's just easier on both parties. And you can do a little teaching at the same time. And I can learn another, and I also learn techniques and variations I haven't seen before. So, it's a two-way street. Anybody else want to add anything to the Budoshin cross certification?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in from a less experienced kind of perspective that George and TJ have given some excellent reasons for cross certification and explain the value of it. I think if you're coming into a martial art and maybe assessing whether you want to pursue it, and you see a description of a sensei's ranks and qualifications, that sometimes cross certification can be confusing if you're looking at someone with multiple Dan rankings, where they're recognized by multiple organizations, maybe that have given them rank. Sometimes it takes some digging to fully understand what the qualifications mean, and to distinguish arts where they've spent 10 years reaching Udansha rank versus arts where they've just been recognized through the process we've been describing by other arts and gotten ranked that way. And that can just sometimes, it's led to confusion for me when I've looked at descriptions of martial artists. And I wonder if that's ever come up as an issue, or I guess as long as it's clear, as long as the criteria for getting rank are clear to someone, it's fine. But to me, it's been somewhat confusing.
Right. Well, that's also why I have the criteria on the website. You have to, in anything in my book, and I've run across senseis in martial arts, I've run across public school teachers, that they're very secretive about what they do. And to me, that is so alien to the learning process. They get upset when someone, I know this from classroom teachers, they protect how they teach, because they don't want another teacher to steal their idea from them. And teachers, we are notorious for stealing ideas. If we see a good idea, we will try it because we want to do a good job. And I think the same thing exists in the martial arts. I think the issue of multiple certifications, once you get beyond 2 or 3, I start questioning the credibility of the person, because how can you study that many different Ryu or martial arts, etc., and be able to teach them? Okay. And like I said, I just ran across a website yesterday that, you want a knee down or sandan, it's like $300. Fourth or fifth dan is $500. Sixth or seventh is $700. It doesn't go beyond seventh. I don't know what they require after that, your firstborn or something like that. But it's the issue is credibility, and what do we charge for cross certification? Was it $25 for the test setup? I mean, you have to look at the motives of the organizations granting this cross certification. One of the things I always tell students when they go, if they're going to go to another martial art or visit another dojo, is if a person's got wallpaper, you start asking, do you have the organization's address or website so that you can contact them and find out, because sometimes you can just go online and say, okay, this is called mail a certificate program, and others are actually credible.
Yeah, the equivalent might be buying academic degrees or
Right.
buying titles of nobility from a hard up aristocrat who wants to sell it to make some money. And
Right.
the question is what is behind this qualification? It seems you just need to ask, well, what did you do to get this? What was the process?
Right. And if they can't, that's all the students, if they can't answer that question, or if they won't give you the address or website or what have you of the organization, walk out the door. I mean, unfortunately, it's consumer beware. And
Yeah.
that's in anything in this country and most other countries. There are very few countries that actually license martial artists.
A corollary question that this has raised for my organization, and this touches on AJA, is, in addition to pursuing cross certification, seeing a RU come under the microscope of AJA and then being able to be a recognized or a member. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I think there's merit to that, even though I'm ignorant of the process beyond, I know there is one, I think. But these seem to go hand in hand. Is that something that could be commented on?
Yeah, that probably because I set up a lot of the procedures way back in the land of never, way back, and they've been modified and changed, etc. But I think you need, and we used to require videos and all that stuff, because what a person puts down on paper and what you see in a video can be two entirely different animals. Decades ago, we had a dojo that applied. The paperwork was beautiful. I mean, it was so impressive. Then we watched the video, and it was choreographed to drum music, which wasn't bad. The only problem was that the uke was taking the falls before the tori was doing the technique. And that was so obvious that the entire routine it was supposed to be random, and the entire routine had been choreographed. And we politely said no, or we just asked them, we'd like to see and they couldn't. I think what messes with some jujitsu is when we say we need to see random attacks on a continuous basis. Because, and I'm not faulting jujitsu that they just teach technique, and here's a technique and here's what you do. But the reality is, what is the purpose of the art? What's the purpose of jujitsu on the street? 2 words. Come on.
Preservation.
What? 2 words.
Self-preservation.
Or that's 1 word. Preservation will work, yeah. But the first word starts with an S.
Stay alive,
Stay alive is a good answer. Okay.
stay safe, stay.
Se- Second letter of the first word is E.
Self-defense.
Self-defense.
Self-defense, right. And to be successful in self-defense, you have to be able to constantly respond to a variety of attacks without knowing what's coming at you beforehand. And that's, that's something I very strongly believe in.
So Sensei, could someone send in a video of them doing like randori or like some kind of sparring and that would count? Or would it be like the competition style that we do where it's like the Tashiwaza?
That's a good, I mean, I'm not in that decision-making environment anymore. But to my way of thinking, the randori is good. I mean, that's okay. It's good. You're dealing with jujitsu versus jujitsu, which can be exceedingly frustrating because if you're playing it right, Seki's only rule was no hits to the face or head in randori. Everything else was fair game. We had insurance company, when we started our program, insurance companies wanted us to use headgear, the form and pads, the whole 9-year body pad. And I finally said to the insurance agent, I said, we're doing jujitsu. If you put all of this gear, and this is your argument, if you put all this gear on a person and expect them to do jujitsu techniques, you are increasing their chances of injury exponentially because a lot of what we do depends on our ability to feel the human body. And there was a pause, and he said, okay, let's try it without all this gear. And we get maybe one claim every 7 or 8 years. I mean, injuries are very low in traditional jiu-jitsu. And yes, Seki would, if we were smart, he had a bad habit of occasionally walking around in class and having everyone line up, and he'd take out a hand bow and do a love tap. He'd do a love tap on people's crotches with the hand bow. And if you weren't wearing a cup, it was a learning experience. And you can't do that today. But the point is, the randori is good, but it's jujitsu versus jujitsu, and it can get pretty sloppy looking. The difference between randori and the street attack defense is that, number one, you don't know what's coming at you. So it's understood that quality may suffer. Quality never looks perfect out in the street.
Right.
The second factor is that we want to see what you can do in as close as possible to a street situation. Okay. Yes, your attacker is not resisting anything you do. He better not. And you're not using excessive force. It is controlled, but that's about as close as we can get to a street situation. And it's just some systems just do not train in that. We start out training our students when they're second or third night in class with that situation. And we call it getting rid of the deer in the headlights of syndrome. And at the end of class, we'll take 10 minutes from them, and we'll just, even if it's a new white belt, they've been in class for 3 weeks, they'll get attacked with 1 or 2 random attacks. What do they do? And after a couple of weeks of this, when they look like garbage, then they finally realize, gee, maybe I should block, or maybe I need to step back or do something rather than just stand there like a deer in the headlights. You're all familiar with the term deer in the headlights? Okay. And once they get past that point, their growth really improves because they realize they can do something. and they get better at it. And we don't look to see how well they blocked or any of that stuff. It's just that they did something. And so I know it's a really long answer to your question, Chase. But that's why we like to see the random attacks.
What Mr. Tucker, Chase, this may help as well. So in my engagement with Mr. Tucker, so in addition to the paperwork, he asks, he'll say, teach, and he'll whatever, half a dozen different scenario techniques, teach them. And then he asks for, I have to look at the message again. I think it's 2 minutes with multiple aggressors coming in with random attacks, and just let it go live for 2 minutes. And those 3 pieces, the paperwork, whatever techniques that he wants to see explained, and then the multiple aggressors, that's what comprises, in my instance, a packet.
And you need to be aware, Chase, this is the hardest part of doing assuming you've trained with random attacks. The hardest part is what I look at as seeing, is the Tory controlling the mat? Which means if you, 2 minutes, 1 minute is a long time on the street. I've had students who've been in street situations, and for most of them, it's over in 5 to 10 seconds. With the attacker down on the ground, with a fracture or dislocation or something of that sort.
Yeah, the time crunch is way different.
Way different. And if you go full bore at the outset of a 1 or 2 minute freestyle, by the time you get to 2 minutes, you're going to be scraping the underside of the mat. So the key is to control the mat and do your techniques at your speed, so that you don't get physically, or your physical exhaustion is as little or less as possible. Because 2 minutes is, a lack of a better phrase, a hell of a long time to be defending yourself, even on the street.
Yeah.
The Saki Chop movies will go on for 2 hours, but that doesn't have, they take a lot of breaks, and it's not really 2 hours. They've choreographed all this stuff. You can practice the randomness, and that's good, but you really, my number one suggestion is I will look to see how tired is the Tory getting, because that shows your control of the mat. And keep in mind that if you control the mat, the attackers can only attack so often. If they control the mat, they can attack as fast as they want. So it's just, it's I don't want to say it's how you play the game, but
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
That's
Back to cross certification. Let me tell you how we do it. Okay, so karate, taekwondo, kung fu, Filipino martial arts, which I love, jujitsu, BJJ on the ground, stand-up jujitsu, all of that. You want to get certified, you are tested in each of them individually. And an instructor, a sensei, in each of those techniques has to approve you. And you got to get if I only have one, I only need one. But if I want to be approved in all, we have to have them approved in all. So that's our cross certification.
That's rigorous.
Yeah, everybody has every system has their own way of doing it. As long as I think my thoughts are, as long as your criteria for cross certification are reasonable, whatever that means, but they're published, which means anyone has access to them. You're not afraid to show what's required. I think you're okay. then you can say, well, this is legitimate, this is not legitimate, this is being totally unreasonable. The $500 bill helps. You know, it all depends what you as the individual sensei are after and what you want. And so I think, you know, that's the issue with cross certification. Some organizations will not cross certify at all, which is their right. I never did it for years. And then finally someone said to me, you know, you really should start considering this. So I sat down with Mark and a couple of black belts to say, okay, if we're going to do this, what do we want to require? Because this has to be legitimate. And everyone was uniform in saying, if we cross certify, it means that the person has to be capable of teaching Budoshin Jujitsu within the Budoshin Jujitsu framework. If they're going to teach something else, hunky-dory. But we're looking for someone who's going to do this. Because that's what's in our book, that's what cross certification should mean. Because it doesn't matter how many martial arts you're cross certified in. If you can't teach them, you know, it's a piece of paper.
So thank you. That was, it's be able to teach them, not be able to do it, but be able to teach it.
Yeah.
That's what we care about.
Yeah, not being able to do it or teach it. Yeah, because you got to be able to do it to well, I can't say it because there's some techniques I can't do well, and I can still teach them, and the students put it together.
Yeah. You at least got to have a lot of experience with the technique.
Yeah, you have
to
to
like really understand it.
Yeah, and so anyway, that's, unless anybody else wants to do anything else with cross certification.
I was gonna say, just real quick. I think it's a good like symbolic measure to acknowledge that the human body only works a certain number of ways, and like if you understand, like a hip throw is a hip throw is a hip throw. The way different schools may teach it may be different, but those are just slight adjustments. The gross motor movements are essentially the same.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good acknowledgement of like, you know, everyone is here to learn from each other and not just like do the same thing that they've been doing.
Right. I mean, even if I test a student for I'll say hip koshinagi, that shows up on I think almost every belt exam. Testing for green belt, first one, it's okay, 6U, yeah, maybe they all do the same kind of hip throw. By the time they're at brown belt, and I say, do a koshinagi, and they've got to know the Japanese term by that time, and they do it usually by osmosis, they probably know at least 6, 8, 10, 12 different kinds of koshinagi.
Right.
Not including hanigoshi, harigoshi, reverse hip throws, you know, and like you said, a hip throw is a hip throw is a hip throw. A hand throw is a hand throw is a hand throw, or a wrist block, you know, whatever you want to call it. Once you get past it, once you get jujitsu people past, I think the same applies in karate and aikido, judo, whatever martial art. Once you get past the terminology and put people together, it's amazing how much they know in common.
Yeah, exactly. The other martial art that I practice, we also do cross certification. And all you have to, so for testing in that art, we have to make grappling flow charts, just in increasing numbers of submissions. So I'm a brown belt in that art. So when I test for black, I need to make a 12 submission flow chart for straight arm bars, bent arm bars, leg locks, and chokes. And really you could just get by like applying a straight arm bar 12 different ways, or applying a triangle choke 12 different ways, or whatever have you. So I like, it's on the same kind of thing you're talking about just now.
Right. The and the value of that, and Darren's been sitting here very quietly. The value of, and there's some rule that stress going in different martial arts that stress, okay, you threw this person, what have you, now you're going to go into 27 different submissions. And they all, and I'm exaggerating here, and they all flow one into the other. And the purpose of that is so that if things go south, everyone's familiar with techniques going south. Okay. If something goes south, you can move into something else very quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And that's the intention of all of that, is to build up in your mind, okay, here's what happens if, so that you can do this without any conscious thinking.
Sensei, what hit home for me?
Just a second. I've never, and I've had, like I said, I've had several students who've been in street situations. Very rarely have they had to go into a submission. And I can only recall actually 2 situations. And in one situation, it was a black belt who had a purse snatcher down in a reverse armbar, and he was, and he was afraid that his leg was under the guy's arm, and he was afraid his leg would fall asleep because it took the police so long to get there. And the people around watching this were saying, "Kill him, kill him, kill him." I mean,
oh my God.
Okay.
Yeah. And you know, it's on the street, if you have a solid hold or submission, you maintain that. You don't say, well, I'm getting bored with this, I'm going to switch to something else. If you only change this, and I will actually knock people down if I see a good submission and then they switch to something else. Many years ago, I was at a competition for another organization, and they had me judge the black belt division. I was one of 3 judges, and these 2 black belts who were out there, it was a kime no kata, which is prearranged. They had their whole sequence worked out, and somehow the uke ended up on the ground. The tori had him in an arm lock, but he was on the wrong side. The arm lock was to the right arm behind him, and uke's face down, and the tori was on the left side. So what does he do? He lets go, gets up, walks around, resets the arm bar. The other 2 judges gave him a 10. I gave him a 0. Okay. At that point, Wally J gets up, and I had never really met Wally J before, except, hello. And he comes over to me and he says, "Why'd you give him a 0?" And so I explained himself, and he says, "You're the only judge that scored him correctly." And he went and sat down.
Wally J, very good, very good.
And that gave us a really solid relationship, just that one incident. But the point is, if you have a good hold and then you let go of it to do something else, it gives the attacker an opportunity to get out. And as I tell my students, you never give, if you have to take a person down into a submission, they don't get any second chances. That's it. And then that goes into the other issue of what is a submission? A submission is, I'm waiting for you to tap out. It's a competition thing. On the street, you know that all of your submissions ultimately should be resulting in some sort of injury to your attacker, so that, or something, so that they can't continue their attack. So to maintain a submission on the street is, well, on the one hand, it's alien to traditional martial arts thinking, but the reality is because we have laws, you, you don't want to get stuck doing something called excessive force,
Right, yeah.
which is an entirely different issue, and that's, it doesn't work out as nice and clean as we would like it to. But anyway, I think we need to move on here. What time is it? It's 8:57. We haven't gotten to the third one yet. Third one is gain a further understanding of how I express Budoshin. At this point in my training, I want to funnel my attention to just a few martial arts, and I really want to understand what makes Budoshin unique. What makes Budoshin unique is we teach everything from a street attack perspective. There are some techniques that are taught just for concept. Okay, Seki taught some techniques just for concept. Never use them. He would never use them on the street. But it taught a concept, such as reaching. If how you reach, we know from experience that how you reach for something determines whether, particularly if a person's grabbing your wrist, how you reach or move. Just a second here. Determines what the effectiveness of the technique. I'm in the Zoom meeting.
You will be back. You're not.
So anyway, that's how you that's all that makes Budoshin Jujitsu unique, is that everything is taught for street attacks from week one of the student being in class, their first night. It's, you've got a front choke, here's a technique for it. Rather than teaching techniques and to just teach a technique and just be proficient in its execution. That's good, but you have to be able to, students have to be able to deal with street situations. And that's how Seki taught. Everything was taught for street attacks. It wasn't just grab my lapel and you're going to do this technique, or grab my,
Funny story, if I can tell it. Filipino martial arts, right? And so I'm in and all these people and we're doing Filipino, and I'm great at knife defense. We're foot away, our feet are there, and I showed them a bazillion different ways and they could never do nothing. And then the teacher, he comes along going off the mat, and he's a big guy, and he puts his arm around me and he says, all your knife defenses are worthless, because when you're right here, my knife is coming right here from 6 inches away. And I stopped teaching people knife defense. They're beautiful. I love the techniques, but they don't work when you're in the hard place.
Knife. Yeah, you have knife attacks are not nice. And like I said, I've had students that have dealt with those on the street. They've come out okay, but knife attacks are a whole different ballgame. Okay, let's move on here. We got to get to one of the new topics because we're 9 o'clock already. I have a very difficult time getting students to kiai. It's like they it's so alien to them to give a loud scream when they're doing. I mean, you can explain the purpose of the kiai, yada yada yada, until you're blue in the face, but does anyone have any unique way of getting students so they will do it on a regular basis on their own without you saying, where's your kiai?
And say, we use an icebreaker. The typical way we begin a class is for me to say, follow me, and I do a front roll fall. And then, like all these little ducklings coming along behind me, the entire class one at a time comes along. And when we want to work kiais, it's simple. I yell, hey! Person behind me yells, B! Next one, C! They start to figure out what letter they're going to have. Everybody wants the letter P. They can't wait to just yell, E! They just think that's awesome. And, you know, so then we have fun. We go through the alphabet. And we do it with the front roll fall. We do it with the back. We do it with side falls. And it's a great warm up. It's a great icebreaker. And it also gets them kiaiing. It's nothing more than a simple game. And then when they have to, hey, during a technique, it's not that big a deal. They've already done it. They did it in a playful way, and everybody's smiling and also focusing because they want to fall safely. It's a great warm up.
I think that I think I'm guilty of not using the word kiai. Kiai. I think that's a fault. But in terms of the principle, we were talking about principles earlier. As one of the principles is the kiai has two sides. This is my perspective, and one is the potential in terms of the startle, breaking concentration, and the other one is to maximize the body mechanics. Because when you punch and you push something, you have to exhale. And so in terms of the principle of breathing and breath, you know, it's a natural when you're in an attack situation, if you're moving forward, to exhale. So I kind of teach it, you know, utilizing two sides of that, but I'm guilty of not using the word kiai. It's like, what's that? So that's a fault.
I use the term kiai just aloud, you know, spirit, yell, or what have you. I don't care. I tell my students, I don't care what you say, as long as it's not more than one syllable. Because you don't want to bite your tongue. And it's to get them to, like you say, when they exhale, they're executing that part of the technique. You want them to put that little, doing that kiai puts a little more energy into their execution. And if they can kiai well, the purpose of the kiai is also to intimidate the attacker, to help make the attacker think that you're somewhat crazy. Because it's amazing how many crazy people win fights.
That's funny.
So I didn't mean, Lonnie, I didn't mean that you have to use the word kiai when you're shouting. Like I say, I don't care what my students say. Years ago, there was a tournament where one student in the competition, I mean, if I jokingly said in the competition, kiais kept the judges awake. And there's one kid that was being thrown, and he kiai'd, and he fortunately did not complete the word, but you heard this loud shit, and then it ended before because he would have been disqualified for using that word. But you know, it's not important. Like I said, it's not important what sound they use. I think Dave's idea is good. Does anybody have any other tricks?
Yeah, one of the ways we work on it is when we're practicing for the tournament style with the one you were describing earlier with just random attacks. is it built into the scoring system are at least 3 loud kiais. So I have people when we're out there practicing on the mat, they're counting how many techniques somebody do, how many submissions did they do, how many kiais did you hear? And it kind of reinforces the idea to get it out there. And to add to what you and Lonnie were saying about it, it being used to startle and focus your energy and all that, it also in a self-defense standpoint attracts attention, which can be very good. So whether that's law enforcement or someone else helping or whatever, you can hopefully get some help that way by making noise.
Yeah, I can definitely confirm everything Will said, having gone through the preparation that Will has put us through for tournaments. But there are just so many practical benefits to kiaiing. I think some people think it's annoying to other people when you're executing a lot of techniques that to kiai every time might be irritating. But I think just to emphasize the practicality of it, the directing of ki energy, alerting other people in a self-defense situation, startling the opponent, those are all like key practical things. It also gives you a sense of confidence, like a sense of adrenaline, just to do that shouting and just to remind students as much as possible that it's a vital part of executing techniques.
My new tennis match, they're kiaiing back and forth all the time.
Yeah.
Sure, they call it something different.
Some very valid points. One of the things that's fun to admit is that in a typical classroom, you're told to sit down, be quiet, and listen. And here we're saying, make a lot of noise. And people appreciate that. That brings out a smile. It's like, yeah, this is a form of participation. One of the other ways that just occurred to me that we facilitate the kiais, and we don't always remember the kiai, but we do kiai a lot in our dojo, is the multiple technique flow, which we work at least every other class. And the kiais are a part of the techniques that we're chaining together. And without them, it's like, hey, so it becomes a bit of a habit when you're working multiple technique flow fairly often, and the kiais are part of that.
We follow what Will was talking about. They're built into testing requirements. So when someone's doing a Goshen Waza, the kiai is part of what they're going to be graded on, and pretty quickly they learn it. And as you said, they like making noise. Adults too.
So for us, the kiai is just part of the explosive movement. You have an explosive movement, and it's your voice, your lungs, everything. You explode at once. And so the kiai is just part of that.
Okay, any other comments or thoughts on kiai? Okay.
I think we ought to ask Darren, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I could throw my 2 cents in there. Why not?
Please do.
It's certainly a challenge for new people that come into a dojo to get them to understand what the importance of what I believe in a kiai is. I actually covered this topic on Thursday night. So one of the things that actually works for me is when people, after explanation and giving them the understanding of why it is important to kiai, not only in demonstration, but then when they fail to do so, then I like to use them as an uke and apply the reverse reason for them to be able to perform kiai in pressure compliance. So I guess another way of saying that would be the either uncomfortableness of the technique being performed on them, or just straight up just saying pain. So that certainly helps them gain some inspiration behind, just like when you're going to kiai, they're screaming like "ay" or "ouch" or "oh," and they're tapping for the submissive type position, but it gives them the understanding of why they're doing it, not only wanting an acknowledgement of something that's uncomfortable to them, but then they're also releasing the tension of either holding their breath when the technique is being applied, or when they're taking a fall and having to release the air from the lungs instead of it being knocked out of their system and the wind knocked out of them, and that being uncomfortable in a follow-up. So some of the reverse compliance behind when they're not understanding the importance of a kiai when you're putting them in certain scenarios and they're just doing it naturally, maybe not thinking that it is a kiai, but ultimately it is in some sort of sense.
Okay, Darren brought up a couple of important issues, and then we're going to end after this. One of the things I train my students on, and there's a method to the madness. They will only stop a submission under two situations. I mean, other than it actually injures a person, and it's obvious. And one is if the opponent taps out or snaps their finger or taps the tori. The other thing is if the person says mate, M-A-I-T-T-E, which is I submit. I don't want them to let up because a person says, ouch, don't, please, it hurts, all these other verbal things. Because, and I'm not putting students down, but it's like, there are two things here. One, the student setting up the technique has a pretty good idea, especially as they move up in rank, as to what the technique is doing to the other person's body by how that other person is reacting. And so they have a pretty good idea of how much pain is being created because they've had the technique done to them. And the other thing is, most guard dogs and police dogs are trained in a language other than English. And the reason for this is because if a police dog is going after a suspect and the suspect turns around and says, stop, sit, you don't want that police dog to stop and sit. The dog is going to say, no comprende. That's Spanish, I don't understand. And he'll continue on with his, whatever the officer wants him to do. Okay. And so part of it is the kiai and the mate and some of the other things in the martial arts are you're trying to get, I forgot this term that comes before responses. You're trying to get automatic response. I can't think of the term.
Reflex,
What?
reflex.
It's not
Reaction.
It's not a reflex or reaction. It's conditioning. You're trying to condition the student to respond in a certain way. And so if they hear the word mate or the tap, they'll let up. But if they hear the word ouch, please don't, it hurts, I have $5,000 in my pocket I can give you, they ignore these comments because a person can say it hurts, ouch, etc., and it really isn't. And if they know, if the person who's doing the technique knows what they are doing to that person's body, they have a pretty good idea of how much pain or discomfort the technique is causing.
You were after Pavlovian response. Pavlov.
Pardon?
Pavlov was the one who trained.
Pavlov, right. Yeah, Pavlov's
Pavlovian.
dog. Yeah. And I hate to say you're training your students to be Pavlov's dogs, but yeah, you're training your students to be Pavlov's dogs to some extent for their own protection. Because you know, if a student puts a lock on you, you can just say, stop, it hurts, don't. And most people will let go because they don't want to hurt another person. But if it's out on the street, you don't want them conditioned to please know it, you know, because most martial arts students, like I said, particularly in jiu-jitsu, they've had the whole Brazilian jiu-jitsu, MMA, they've had these holds applied to them. They know what they do. They know how much it hurts. They know what will happen at certain points. and it's sort of relying on the good judgment of the student to know when to let up.
In our knees,
I
we
will.
train to disarm, but then you go to the next move and you hand it back. And so then this cop disarmed the guy and handed his gun back, and the guy shot him.
Yeah, well, that's not good. I mean, like, you know, I've put people into proper arm locks. And I don't just rely on the arm lock. I'll also have my other hand and a nerve in their neck. That's what's really controlling the pain level. And usually, if you have a properly set hold, and you know this from judo and like aikido and jujitsu, if you have a properly set hold, you're not injuring the person. They are. They're injuring themselves because they are resisting. If they don't resist, the hold doesn't hurt. And which is the advantage of teaching what are called proper holds to your students. And that's really important as a skill. And like I said, you can sense from the other person as to how much they're hurting by how much the more they resist, the more the technique, the more the lock or the hold is going to hurt. And what you're after is compliance. You want them to cooperate with you. And if they don't resist, the technique doesn't hurt, life goes on. And maybe that's a kind of cold way of looking at things. But if you're concerned about your own protection, who's number one?
Sensei, one of the things in some of the topic that we're mentioning right now goes back to another topic earlier in pressure and compliance. And if you're using a technique for compliance on an individual for your own safety, but you're not trying to injure, then it's one of the things that I like to make sure that I make my students aware of is if you're holding a certain technique on someone, eventually the tolerance of that technique will almost go numb. So you have to understand as the person applying the technique, how much to apply and releasing a little bit of that tension to almost in relief, but not to be able to let them go, but to just kind of release the technique a little bit to be able to reapply if it's necessary for compliance measures. Otherwise, the technique will only go two ways. One, it becomes almost numb to the individual that you're applying it to, or two, if you're continuing to apply the highest level, eventually you're getting to the point to where you're doing physical damage or breaking. So when you almost set and reset, understanding the tension that's applied, you can get the same reaction in compliance all of the time.
Right. And I agree with you 100%. That's a very important, that's part of your control with a proper hold, is that you can, if you sense there's no resistance, you can slack up a bit, which also lets the person know, this is, there's some reciprocal action going on here. And if the person then starts to resist, you have that ability then to tighten up and make the hold more secure. And that's, again, that's one of the advantages of a proper hold or lock. And there aren't that many proper holds or locks. And I generally classify a proper hold or lock is a lock that you cannot get, if it's set properly, you cannot get out of it without risking injury to yourself. Because if it's set properly, the person who has set the hold isn't causing your injury. You are, because you're trying to get out of it.
All right.
I'll actually hold up in a court of law. Been there. It's for lack of a better, and again, this being a little cold, you have to put the burden of proof has to switch from you to your attacker. And if you can explain what a proper hold is and how it's applied. et
He'll be
cetera.
back in a second.
Oh,
But
there he is.
the question of the proper hold and a proper lock is great. How do we do a proper throw? I mean,
Proper
this
proper
is
throw.
subtle, very subtle. Thank you.
Proper throw is not, does not come under the classification of proper holds and locks. Because a proper throw, depending on how you do it, is either that person is either not going to get up or they're going to land without a scratch on them, one of the two. And in the street, a quote unquote proper throw, the attacker does not get up. Because you've decided to, well, not you, but the situation resulted in the concrete cracking.